So, are AI therapists a good idea? Well, in some ways there are some benefits. In a lot of ways there are a lot of cons, at least at this point in time. It is a really, really big growing trend, especially among the younger generations. And there's lots of reasons for why people might look up an AI therapist. There's the question of instant access, so you can jump into it whenever you want to, which can be really, really helpful for some people. There's also the idea that therapy does cost a lot of money. It is very expensive, and especially if you go for generally higher quality therapy, it can be very, very expensive per session, and it can go on for a really long time. The other thing is, especially if you're in the UK, if you were to access free therapy, so for instance through the NHS or things like that, then there can be really, really long waiting lists for that. So in some areas of the UK, the waiting lists for NHS therapy can be over a year as well. So you need help now, you're in crisis now, and they could be saying you've got a long wait ahead of you. So it's really understandable for why people might feel like their best answer is to look out for AI therapy. And with that, there are a lot of problems that can come out as well. So I really wanted to make this video to highlight all of the risks that are involved with AI therapy. If you still want to use it as a resource, I'm not saying don't use it at all, but there are risks involved that I do feel like you should be aware of. So to give a bit of context around me, I am a psychologist. I've worked in the field for over 10 years. I do have a lot of insight into how these things work and how they should work and why they work the way they do as well. So to begin with, the first thing that you would do with a therapist is you would usually set out a contract where you would discuss confidentiality. It is really important as part of the process of therapy that everything that you do raise is confidential, and that your therapist has accountability as well. So if you go with any therapist that should be giving therapy, they should have some form of insurance, whether that's private insurance that they have in and of their own right, or whether that's through the organization that they might work for example, the NHS or any other kind of healthcare service that works in your area. If you go to an AI to use them as a therapist, neither of these two things are the case. AI does not have any accountability. They don't have any insurance. They don't have any repercussions if they do give you bad advice. And there are loads and loads and loads of articles out there of AI giving bad advice and it ending up leading to a really worst case scenario in lots of ways. So do you really want to trust a system that doesn't have any accountability if things do go wrong? The other thing is, AI isn't bound by confidentiality in the same way that your therapist is. In fact, they're pretty open about the opposite of that. They openly say that they use your conversations to train their AI. There's no reason that they wouldn't be selling that information on. In fact, a lot of them essentially do. And all it takes is someone to essentially access those chat logs, and they've got everything that's there about you as well. There is an argument that AI can be used to generate a profile about you as a person. In fact, going forwards with things like digital ID and stuff like that, that's probably going to be even more the case going forwards. Digital ID, if you're not aware, is a thing that's going on in the UK. I'm hearing that it's happening across a lot of Europe, so it may be an issue where you are in the near future if it's not already. But these are the kinds of things that are happening going forwards. And this may even influence what kind of adverts you get or anything like that as well, for better or for worse. So the next thing is just thinking a little bit about how ChatGPT itself works, or other language learning models as well, if we're going to be a bit more specific. So when it comes to language learning models, it can feel like it's holding a conversation with you. It can feel like it's an interaction that's as good as any human interaction. But actually the way that it works is it doesn't necessarily understand what you're saying per se. What it's doing is it assigns essentially a numerical value to the words that you use and the order in which you use them. And it will search online for what are the generic kind of replies that you might get to this. So essentially, it's not formulating a real response to you. It's essentially predicting what would someone generally say to this. And AI also has a really big problem of, if it doesn't know an answer to something, it needs to provide you with some kind of an answer in order to push engagement. So AI can also make things up quite a lot of the time as well. AI can get things wrong. And as part of my research for this video today, I did try a few questions out with a language learning model. And to give you an idea of the kind of thing, putting it into maybe layman's terms, I asked it a few therapeutic questions. So I think I've got depression, what should I do? Or I really want to boost my motivation, how do I work on that? And these are really, really common questions that we might get a lot in therapy. And if I were to paraphrase it, essentially the kinds of responses I got back were not necessarily wrong. They were advice that we do give, but were they the best advice? Were they really on topic? Not really. It was more just like a generic info dump. So the quality of the information it was giving back was essentially equivalent to if I'd said, help, I broke my leg, what should I do? ChatGPT was essentially coming back with, well, milk is good for your bones, so you should drink a lot of milk. And technically it's not wrong, but also, is it the best advice? Not really. So this is the kind of issue that you're likely to run into. The other thing with this is it has a bit of an info dumpy nature, which can be really useful if you're in a good headspace and you've got a good amount of insight and you kind of understand what you're asking it to do and what kind of information it's giving back. That can be really useful for some people. In the context of therapy, though, if you are in a crisis, if you are really struggling, getting barraged with loads and loads of information really quickly may not necessarily be the best thing for you. It can actually make you feel quite overwhelmed, actually. And there's also the idea that it will go through, this is what you should do, A, B, C, D, so on and so on and so on. Here's this technique, here's this technique, here's this technique. Like I said, the validity of what techniques it's suggesting for the question you're asking can vary, but it doesn't necessarily run you through how to do those techniques properly. If you were to try that technique out, it doesn't necessarily have a function where it can really reliably tell you, are you doing that technique correctly or not? So to give you an example here, one technique that I really commonly use in my kind of therapy is something called thought challenging, or to use a more technical term, cognitive restructuring, for anyone who might be aware of that. And the idea of this is you essentially try and challenge any thoughts that you have. So some people are aware of the concept of thoughts aren't facts, for example. So it's, how do we know if what we're thinking about a situation is accurate? Well, we need to break it down. We need to look at what evidence there is supporting this thought, what evidence there is against this thought. It's a really, really, really powerful technique that a lot of people really get on well with, but it does take a few weeks to really get the hang of what really actually counts as good evidence, what really should you be thinking about here, and what things are maybe extrapolating too much, things like that. ChatGPT would not be able to reliably give you that kind of feedback. It may have a go at it if you ask it directly, but generally speaking, it may not necessarily be able to tell, because it is essentially taking everything you say in isolation. It isn't looking at the broader context. It isn't looking at essentially everything else that fits into this picture here. So what may be good evidence for one person in one situation may not really count as good evidence for someone else in another situation. And as a therapist, they would have that understanding of you. They would have that dialogue with you where you come to a mutual understanding of that. ChatGPT essentially isn't. The other thing with ChatGPT is it is a little bit sycophantic by nature, because it's programmed to make you like it. It's programmed to make you engage with it. And the more you engage with it, the more data it gets, the more money it makes, so on and so on and so on. It's a business at the end of the day. And what that means is if it's programmed to make you like it, it's not necessarily going to give you any pushback. If you say something that's completely wild and you do kind of need to be called out on that thing, is ChatGPT going to do that, or is it just going to go with you? Any good therapist, the way I tend to think of them is, if you were to think of a really good parent or a really good teacher, a good therapist should mimic some of those qualities where they are really supportive, they are absolutely on your side, but if you overstep the line, there's a black and white line there where they will call you out for it, whether that's immorally, but also, if you're thinking something that's completely wild and out there and has no basis in reality, that might be feeling really, really real to you. So For example, we could really, really work ourselves up in a kind of worry spiral, feel like something is really, really dangerous and something bad is going to happen when it's really not. A good therapist would push back against that. ChatGPT, less likely to do that. So it just wants you to like it. So it's going to tell you what you want to hear. And that's exactly how it's programmed. It's not going to do that. And even if you do give it certain prompts to tell it to give you pushback, it realistically won't, because that essentially goes against what it's trying to do. So there's a few factors to consider there. Like, do you really want to just have someone tell you everything you want to hear? Or do you want to essentially have some progress where you could potentially develop yourself and start to get better and identify and spot these underlying cycles that you might be falling into as well? So when I say cycles, we can fall into kind of vicious cycles with our behaviors or our thought patterns that may feel like we're being adaptive or trying to help ourselves, but actually they might be making our problem worse overall. So the other thing with ChatGPT is it does rely on you having a good amount of insight. So when I say insight, I mean you understand what mental health is, you understand what symptoms mean, what kind of problems. So for example, you might know that depression is associated with a depressed physical feeling, like you are feeling slowed, you are feeling tired, lethargic, all of those kinds of things. And you may know that depression is associated with sleep disturbances or appetite disturbances and things like that. If you do know that, you might be able to reliably say, I think I'm depressed, I match all of these symptoms, what do I do? And then you can go into more detail and ask all of those different questions. If you don't necessarily know what those diagnostic criteria are or what kind of symptoms might mean what, which is really, really commonly the case, then what kind of questions are you going to be asking and what kind of answers are you going to be getting to those questions? Is it really going to get to the bottom of the problem for you? And this is one of the reasons why when you go to a therapist, you will usually do a intake assessment. So they will go through and ask you lots and lots of different questions to try and identify what is the core of the problem here. Because unfortunately, there is a lot of overlap between a lot of these problems. So to give you an example, if you feel like you have ADHD, there's a lot of overlap with the symptoms of ADHD and anxiety disorders. So if you go onto ChatGPT and say, I think I've got ADHD, what should I do? The advice it's going to give you may not be great in itself, but also it's going to be tailoring that more towards ADHD when in reality, it may be that you have an anxiety problem and you're not actually targeting that or getting anything useful that helps you to get to the problem. Another one may be you experience anxiety, but actually that anxiety is coming from being depressed, for example. So if you're really depressed, you're not going out, you lose your confidence, you aren't really doing anything that's giving you a boost to your mood. Suddenly the idea of doing things can feel like it's a big exertion for you. If you've had a week where you've not really left your house or done anything, the idea of going out and seeing your friends might feel really anxiety inducing, and you might identify that as being anxiety when in reality it's really stemming from the depression. Just to give you an example very quickly, there can be a lot more to those kinds of things. But yeah, are you in a position where you've got a good enough insight to ask the right questions to give you the answers that you even need in the first place from ChatGPT? Again, I'm using ChatGPT as an example. Use any other example of language learning models, AIs, therapy AIs that you want to here. The rules really do apply to all of them at this point in time. The other thing that is really important with AI is you can dip in and out, which from an accessibility point of view can be really good. But one of the things that happens with therapy is generally you'll be locked into once a week. That's usually what most therapies will do, although that can vary depending on circumstances. I appreciate that. But you will see a therapist once a week. You've got someone that you are held accountable to. So this means if they set you some home practice to do in between sessions, and cut a long story short, if it's a good therapy, they should, because you're only spending 1 hour a week in therapy and there's like 150 hours over the course of a week. You're going to get a lot more out of it if you're doing things between sessions as well as in the sessions. But essentially you've got someone that you're held accountable to. You need to do this work. Otherwise, you have to go and talk to that person and explain why you haven't done it. Now, I'm not saying that therapist should, drag you over the coals if you've not done the homework necessarily, but at the same time, you feel that sense of accountability and that motivates you to do the work. And also the therapist, again, presuming they're good, they should tailor the amount of homework that you're doing to what your capabilities are. If you're really struggling with motivation, it should be gently easing you in. If you are highly motivated, again, tailoring it so you can pick up more stuff to have a go at over that week, things like that. They can also clarify, like, do you really understand what they're asking you to do as well? And going back to that point I made earlier of, do you really understand the technique that you're using? Can you show them that you can do it correctly? Things like that. You've got that. The other thing is, there's a really important idea. I find it very, very important in my own therapeutic work, of what I tend to call momentum, which is essentially by having a session once a week, you build up a routine, you build up a momentum in what you're doing each week, and you can gradually build things up over time. So week one, you start with basic techniques, and then you gradually introduce more and more advanced techniques over time as that person gains more of a skill set, for example. And when it comes to ChatGPT, if, again, AI language learning models, you don't have that ability to generate the momentum in the same way. If you're not feeling it that week, you don't have to turn up. So yeah, you might have one week where you've got a week off work and you're using it every single day, and then you don't use it for a month, and you've lost all of that momentum, you've lost all of that routine, you've lost everything that you gained in that week that you had off, just as an example there. And if you're not touching it for a month, that might be a sign that, are you having a bit of a lapse? Are you suddenly struggling with your motivation, and that's what's making you not engage with it, or things like that? So if that's the case, there's an argument to be said, that's probably the time that you need the therapeutic input the most. But if it's something like an AI language learning model where you can dip in and out as you feel like it, if you're not feeling up to it that day, you're not doing it, you're not getting that input. And also, again, feeding back to what I said earlier, is the input going to be the best overall? The other thing around this topic as well, actually, is that when it comes to therapy, therapies tend to have a procedure. So I specialize in cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, although I do know some other forms of therapy as well. And most of them have a procedure. So if I were to, for example, treat someone with depression, the treatment protocol for that could last anywhere between 12 and 20 sessions, depending on how they progress. But generally, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end to that protocol. I won't go into details of what exactly that is in this video, but maybe in a future video. And when it comes to a therapist, they will essentially help you to understand what are the mechanics of depression, using that as an example. What's going on that's causing you to feel this way? And we also have a lot of knowledge around scientific studies, things like that, that help us to progress through that protocol to help you to get better in a methodical way that makes a lot of sense. And we can tailor it according to you as well. If you use ChatGPT, again, it's using everything in isolation, unless you just happen to know exactly what model would be best for depression or whatever kind of difficulty you're having. Are you going to be able to ask the right questions? Are you going to be able to do those things? And also, good therapy like CBT, the reason that it does end and it doesn't go on forever is because the idea is that it's trying to teach you skills. It's trying to help you to manage things independently so that you don't need to rely on a therapist for the rest of your life. ChatGPT, like I said earlier, it wants you to engage in it more. It's not going to have this structure. It's not going to have this underlying narrative where it could push the conversation in a certain way, or manage the conversation in a certain way in order to help you to come to a certain conclusion or help you to learn a certain technique. It's just going to essentially mirror back whatever you put into it. So the more you engage in ChatGPT, the more it's going to mirror back at you. And that's it, essentially. It's not going to have this underlying narrative. It's not going to have an overall structure that it's working towards here. So again, you may pick up skills, you may pick up ideas, but they're a little bit of a kind of scattershot, and there isn't a structure that's coming with it. It may give you a really advanced technique straight out of the gate that might be really hard to do, or it may give you all of the easy things straight away. Totally depends on what question you ask and things like that. So to give you an idea of this kind of context, just very briefly, in cognitive behavioral therapy, we quite often start off with behavioral interventions, not because they're necessarily better, but behavioral interventions tend to be a lot easier to do. It's a lot easier to change what you're doing rather than how you think. And by changing those behaviors, it can break down any vicious spirals that you might be in with bad habits, or it might help to boost your motivation or things like that. And that can give you a big boost in and of their own right that can then help you to engage in the thought work a lot better, and you will find it a lot easier at that point. ChatGPT, if you go to it and you say, I'm depressed, what do I do? It may chuck you in at the absolute opposite end of the spectrum, which would be looking at something called core beliefs, for example, which is really, really deeply held beliefs that are generally considered very hard to work on, especially independently without support from someone as well. So there's all of this so far. At the moment, maybe you're starting to see that the idea of an AI therapist isn't the best, but there is a little bit more to this. So I touched on this a little bit already, but there is this idea of a therapist isn't just here to give you the information, they also act as a coach. So this is something that ChatGPT, as far as I've seen, it seems, again, AI language learning models tend to be unable to do. So the idea of coaching is their patient is turning up every week, that you're working through the protocol, you're generating that therapeutic momentum, like I said earlier. But if the patient has a bad week, if they have a setback, if something happens that just completely knocks them off their stride, like they have a relationship breakup or something like that, the therapist is there to coach them. They're there to support them, help them to adapt on the fly, and they're there to help them to reflect on those experiences as well and gain things from those experiences. So sometimes in therapy, having an absolutely awful situation like a relationship breakup can actually give you really, really useful information and learning going forwards that you could take forwards for the rest of your life. ChatGPT isn't going to have that coaching ability. It's not going to be able to help you to sit there and think or sit there and reflect on it. It's also not going to be able to motivate you. So one really important technique that we use quite a lot with various forms of therapy is something called motivational interviewing, which is essentially this idea of, in order to get better, you might need to do things that you really don't want to do. So the therapist is there to motivate you to do it and help you to see the benefits of it and help you to change your mindset around doing the thing. As an example here, there's a really commonly held belief in people with OCD. So OCD might be a kind of contamination OCD, where if things are dirty, I'm going to get really sick and then something really bad is going to happen, or something like that. There's lots and lots of different manifestations of OCD that can take lots and lots of different appearances and themes. But a really, really commonly held belief across those different themes is better safe than sorry. Why take the risk? If you're just punching information into a language learning model or an AI, then how is that AI going to work around that with you? With a therapist, they're going to be able to motivate you. They're going to be able to have that perceived authority where the therapist knows that, you see the therapist as knowing what they're doing. There's an inherent trust there. You trust the therapist that they're not going to put you in a difficult situation. Whereas with an AI language learning model, are you going to have that trust? This leads us on to another point, which is that there's a lot of evidence out there that a therapeutic relationship, so the relationship that you develop with your therapist in and of itself, is a mechanism of change. So a really, really, really common example for this may be in the case of trauma. So as a male therapist myself, I quite often work with women who have been through, let's just say, non-consensual things for YouTube's sake. And that can really undermine their trust in men as a general concept. They can find it really difficult to be around men for prolonged periods of time. They can struggle to open up around men. They can struggle to see men as anything other than being dangerous, let's say. And just by working through the therapy together, without directly calling it out, me being their therapist, if they feel up for it, I appreciate a lot of people don't necessarily feel like they would want a male therapist in that situation. It can be really, really powerful for them to have avatar doesn't feel like the right word, but have a memory of a trustworthy person that they can then use to help themselves to open up and develop in other ways there. Another thing would be for things like social anxiety. If you're really struggling to socialize and you've got a person that you are talking to every week and you can bounce ideas off of, you can practice things with, that's going to help you to improve your confidence in your ability to generate relationships a lot more than if you were to go on to an AI and essentially say the same kinds of things. So there is that as well. And same with low self-esteem, same with loads and loads and loads of different kinds of problems that you might be struggling with. So the therapeutic relationship in and of itself can be really, really powerful. And you may have a variation of that with something like a AI, but is it going to be as beneficial? Probably not. It's more, I feel like even if you were to really, really lean into an AI language learning model as hard as you could, there is still going to be a bit of your brain essentially saying, I know this is functionally a robot. So am I really gaining as much as I want to here? Again, think of that sycophantic nature of AIs as well. If you're trying to practice something, are they just going to tell you what you want to hear? Are you, if you're trying to develop your self-confidence, are they just going to tell you what you want to hear? Or are they going to push back in the ways that may help you to develop that confidence over time? So lots and lots of different factors to consider here. Another thing, and this goes back to this idea of AI being essentially like an info dump kind of approach, is a really, really important part of therapy is something called guided discovery. So as a CBT therapist, we go through regular, usually yearly, reaccreditation cycles. We literally get marked on, are we using guided discovery? And if we don't, we arguably could even go as far as losing our jobs. So that's how important guided discovery is. What is the idea of guided discovery? Well, the idea of guided discovery is that essentially, when it comes to giving someone an answer to their problem, if you just straight up tell them what the answer is, they may push back. They may just outright reject it. They may not really hold on to that information, or they might sort of nod and agree, but not really get where you're coming from, or things like that. So guided discovery is this idea of you control the conversation, you guide the conversation to help that person to come to that conclusion themselves. In a roundabout way of speaking, it's almost like a positive manipulation, you could call it. So we've all been there. To give an example, it might be, you know, someone who is in a relationship and their partner is really, really abusive, but this person just like they can't see it and they refuse to leave this person, and they think you're all just being way too sensitive or way too overprotective and things like that. If you were to just tell that person over and over and over again, like, I think this is bad, you should get out of there, they're just going to push back more and more and more. Whereas if you were to help them to see from an outsider's perspective why it's so bad for them, they may be more receptive to that. Or if they can see the evidence, for example, feel like they've come to that conclusion themselves, they're going to be a lot more receptive to that. This is really, really useful in terms of, you know, if someone feels like fundamentally, as a person, I'm not good enough, it might be a self-esteem issue or something like that. If you were to just tell them, no, you are good enough, they're going to feel like maybe you're just trying to be nice, maybe, again, sycophantic like ChatGPT or AI. Maybe they just feel like you're being polite or something like that. If you can show them the ways that they are good enough as a person, if you can show them all the things that they're achieving or help them to recognize those things more, they're going to be a lot more receptive to that than if you're just there bluntly telling them those things. So guided discovery is a really, really super important style of approach in therapy. And again, we know that AI language learning models, they're functionally a mirror. They just bounce back whatever you show them. Whatever questions you ask, you have to ask the right questions. They're just going to give you an answer to that question functionally in isolation. They're not going to have the capability of giving you guided discovery in that kind of way. And guided discovery can be used in lots and lots of different circumstances as well. So I gave you an example there that's almost like a belief style approach. It can be really helpful with problem solving and things like that. So again, if you were feeling like I don't have enough money for rent this month, which I appreciate is a growing problem across the economy right now, then if I were to just tell you, why don't you do this? You might go ahead and do that, but you're not necessarily going to gain anything from it. Whereas guided discovery would essentially be looking at, have you been in this situation before? What's helped before? And you may go, actually, the last time this happened, I did this and that really helped, or I did this and it really didn't help. You start to develop those skills yourself. So I suppose guided discovery, you could think of it as, there's a saying in the UK, I don't know if it is an international saying in any way, of if you have a starving man, if you give him a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach him how to fish, he eats for a lifetime. That's essentially what guided discovery is looking at, to maybe round things off there. So there's all of these different factors when it comes to language learning models, using them as a therapist. Are they going to be helpful? Well, now you know the risks that are involved. Generally speaking, I would recommend, if you do use a language learning model or an AI, I wouldn't use it in isolation, because you do need the ability to identify, is it giving you good advice or not? So what I would suggest is publications. I appreciate we are getting into an era of lots of AI publications out there, but any publications is what the AI is telling you. Is that matching up with things? Can you find any research on the subject as well? So if you are going to use AI, it might even be worth thinking about what model is used to treat something like depression, what model is used to treat something like OCD, things like that, and work from there. Get it to explain the model to you, get it to explain the research to you, and then you're going to get that level of insight. I would also think about, what are the diagnostic criteria for the problem that you feel like you've got. It's not a perfect system if you use the diagnostic criteria. Generally speaking, there's a lot of overlap with diagnostic criteria. There's a reason why people go through years and years of training before they're allowed to diagnose. If I were to give you an example, sleep problems. Technically, to my knowledge, sleep problems are only really a diagnostic criteria of depression, as far as common mental health disorders are concerned, and arguably insomnia. But does it feature in everything else? Well, yes, it does. PTSD, you can get nightmares and wake up in the night, and that can constitute sleep problems. If you have something called generalized anxiety disorder, which is kind of excessive worrying, then you can lie there in your bed at night and your mind is going 100 miles an hour and you can't fall asleep. And that's a sleep problem, but it's not a diagnostic criteria of those things. So it's not a perfect system. Generally speaking, I would always say going to a good therapist is the gold standard. But if you are going to use a language learning model or an AI, make sure you do research outside of the context of that AI before you jump into it with both feet. So thanks for watching this video. This is the first video on the channel. I will be uploading more in the future. I will generally be looking at any kind of topics around psychology. So I might be looking at hot topics like this. I will also be uploading lots of different content around self-help. So I am really passionate about this idea that there isn't easily accessible information out there, and it is a bit of a minefield for everyone. So if you do want any advice going forwards on common mental health disorders, this would mean any kind of anxiety, depression, trauma, anything like that, keep an eye on this channel. Going forwards, we will be uploading lots of content around those kinds of things to give you some ideas that you can use practically as well. So thanks for watching the video again, and all the best. Please subscribe, please click the follow button, all of those kinds of things, and I will catch you again soon. Bye for now.